Now, I'd like to start with a few anecdotes. And this will inevitably remind me that I am now somewhat long in the tooth. But I hope my stories, to start off, will remind all of us how vital new technologies have become to heritage and culture, and specifically, at least in my case, to museums. Now, I'm going to start with my time as a graduate student. As you can hear, I'm American. I'm half American, half Dutch, in case there are questions. And I did my doctorate at NYU, and at that time, I came across someone named Michael Montias. Won't mean much to you, an economist at Yale, got really interested in Vermeer, and he was the first person in my field to use a database. He used a database to set up a whole list of probate inventories. So what was listed in inventories in the 17th century. And at that point, scales fell from my eyes because I realized we were going to be able to do art historical research in a totally new way. Eventually, Montias, you see him on the left, his database ended up at the Frick collection, and now, some 20 years later, we don't even think about these things. But I wanted to start with this just to remind you how quickly we've come, both in terms of what we expect and what kind of art historical research we can do, which obviously has its extension to all the work that you do yourself. The second anecdote has to do with what happened to me next. I was living in London, and I was asked to develop a pilot for Tate Modern, something that we would now call an app, but this was well before the iPhone, and what you see on the screen now is a PDA. Anyone remember a PDA? Know what it stands for, right? Personal Digital Assistant. This is a Toshiba model. And what we developed for Tate Modern was really the kind of app that you would now associate with even some of the more technology-savvy art galleries in the world. We were doing things like question and answer and games on these little devices. This came out in 2003, just to give you a sense of timing. And also around this time, around the millennium change, many of you will remember this, but most museums thought that a website was pure evil. What do you put on your website? Maybe your address, opening hours, but oh no, as soon as you put digital pictures on there, people will sit behind their computer and stay at their desk and never come in. I actually thought that was dead wrong at the time. For those of you philosophers, I completely disagree with Walter Benjamin about art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and I'm glad to say that what I thought then has to some extent come true now, that the more people are familiar with the reproduction, the more they hunker to go and see the actual object. And this will be, in fact, a kind of a leitmotif that will run through my talk this afternoon. Now, so these three examples, websites for museums, a PDA tour, Michael Montias's database, they're all from my little life, but they show us how, in the past 20 years, how far we've come, but also, to some extent, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, or there's nothing new under the sun. And that is more specifically, in terms of museums, one, there is an inherent resistance to new technologies. You all know that, don't you? And two, there is a real concern, especially amongst art museums, that new technologies should in some way disturb the relationship that the viewer has with the actual object. And it's particularly useful to see how these tensions play out in my field. I'm a specialist in old master paintings, partly because we're some of the most conservative ones out there, in case you don't know that already. So I was introduced to you, but you will have read it in your program. I'm now the director of the Moritz House, and I can tell you with some pride that we are one of the world's most important collections of Dutch paintings of the so-called Golden Age, so 17th century. We are really one of the top 4 collections in the world in our area, and we're only 30 minutes away from here, so if you haven't been yet, please go. And yes, we're also the home of the girl with the pearl earring, who you saw at my first slide, and the goldfinch, and many other masterpieces. Now, one of our great advantages, but also our great challenge, is that we only do Dutch paintings of the 17th century and around, so a little 16th century, a little Flemish, but it's really incredibly focused. And that's a great advantage. Everybody knows what we stand for, but it's also somewhat of a disadvantage when you're aiming to reach a broad and a young audience. As I often tell my own colleagues, listen, what we have to do is make these really old, dark paintings come alive to people. How do we make them cool? And although my primary job now is running the museum, as you can tell, I've had a long interest in using new technologies, and I think they often help us with this mission to get the stories out there, what these stories tell, these old dark paintings. And they very much inform our strategy at the Maurits House. We even embrace new technologies as a way to reach a broader and often younger and international audience. And so in the remaining time I have here, I'm going to give you some examples, broaden out here or there, but in the hope that they will have some resonance to you, whether you're working in metadata or whatever the field is, centralized or decentralized. I think some of the stories I'm going to tell you should mean something to you. At least I hope so. Now, at the core of almost all the discussions that museums have had in the past and continue to do now is the issue of access to high-quality digital reproductions. And we heard a little bit about it here this afternoon. And I am the last person to lecture you about choosing platforms, metadata, centralizing protocols. That's not what I'm here to do. But what is important from my vantage point is that open access to reproductions is moving forward incredibly quickly. Now, many of you will be aware of the Rijksstudio, great initiative, fantastic design, really wonderful, also much helped by the Rijksmuseum's fabulous PR department. I don't mean to sound defensive about this, but a lot of other museums provide high-res images free of charge as well. And in fact, if you want to use their stuff for commercial rates, you actually pay. So beware, there are various options on this. But anyway, they took a great initiative, and we've seen the Met follow, and Maurits House also. In fact, a study prepared for the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation 2013, for those of you who don't know it, it's worth reading, makes it very clear that we were already heading in this direction well before the Rijksstudio opened. But as this very useful report points out, decisions about embracing open access depend on the nature of the museum's collection and its financial capacity. We talked a little about following the money just now. Well, I certainly think that is true. So let me use my website, Maurits House website, as an example. We're relatively well-resourced, and we have an extremely manageable collection of only 850 paintings. So they're two-dimensional objects, small collection, pretty easy to handle. So, being the Maurits House, we not only present our whole collection online in very good resolution, but we show the paintings front, back, and in the frame, because we always like to do it just a little better. They're all free for download, and of course, if you want to go and make sneakers out of these, please let us know, and we'd like to talk to you about the commercial ramifications. Now, I'm not telling you to brag about the Maurits House, although I am, of course, very proud, but to come back to these 2 points. The Maurits House can do this because the collection is manageable in size and type of object. And secondly, we are really pretty well-resourced. We used money from the lottery here to pay for this, to the photography and all the rest of it. We have recently also shared the entire collection on Europeana, you'll be happy to know, and we did a lot of haggling with Google Arts and Culture over all kinds of contractual questions, but we will soon be on Google Arts and Culture as well. Now, I had a little conversation before I started this talk with someone and we were talking about, what's in it for us as a museum, and I think I should be coming back to that later, but for us, we just want to share this stuff, and we can afford to do it, and we can do it well. But you should know, all of you probably do know, there are still many museums that still generate income off of image rights, and they don't want to give it up. This certainly counts for smaller institutions and who sometimes still have the false hope that they're going to generate a lot more income on this in the future. I don't agree with that. But also there are large institutions like the Réunion des Musées Nationaux, the Royal Collection in the UK. They still make money on it, and they're not going to give that up for the moment. So this is still something in transition, although I very much think open access will triumph. I certainly hope so. Sharing images is, though, only a very small part of what we're doing now. We're moving away from static images that sit on the screen or even comparisons to much more dynamic storytelling sites. I had the most remarkable conversation recently with someone who represents the IIIF. You all know it, the International Image Interoperability Framework recently. And he was so proud, and he should be. And he showed me one of the APIs. Here's the Mirador viewer. He showed this to me, and he just thought this was the greatest thing. And I agree, it's fantastic. But I think we, as many of us art museums, are already quite a lot farther in this. We want to do more than compare high-res resolutions. And I'm just showing you a still here of a website that we launched last year, I think, about our goldfinch by Carl Fabricius. Now, I've got someone in the booth upstairs who's going to sort of show you the website. I'm not at the controls, but just to give you a little sense of what I mean by the difference between comparing images and storytelling. This is all about the little goldfinch, and as it loads, you're going to have lots of options. There's sound. He's going to bring us into you can see little pop-ups. We're going to hear some noise.
The Goldfinch by Carl Fabricius. Possibly the most viewed little bird in the world. Probably the most famous bird in the history of art.
Maybe you just want to click on the sound there just for fun. Oh. There he goes. Okay, so this is just a little flavor. I encourage you all to go ahead and find out more about the goldfinch, but I think my point is clear. This is a lot more than just comparing two high-resolution images. This is about telling the story and giving it a lot more context. And then what we want to do also is more than share this knowledge, but tailor it to specific audiences. How to engage. Now, I realize after hearing this whole conversation about centralized and non-centralizing, I may now tread on slightly delicate territory, but we have recently started to work with Google on a very special Vermeer project. And ironically, the image that I put in my PowerPoint here is slightly corrupted. That was not a deliberate and not a knock on Google. But what this project is going to do is bring high-res images of the 36 known Vermeers in the entire world, in various museums throughout the world, and one private collection together with storytelling, with a sense of location where they are. And we're using Google to do this because we want to use their PR power. I mean, obviously, we can reach the whole world using them. They're going to use YouTubers and all kinds of things to do this. But what's interesting about this project, which really is a first, is that the Maurits House is leading on the content. I can call up the director of the Louvre and say, listen, you're not on the Google Arts and Culture platform. I realize that, but will you join our project? And they believe in the content that we offer them, and they have agreed to come on board. And this has never happened before on this international scale with as diverse a group of museums for a very specific project. So watch this space. We should be launching somewhere before the end of the year, and I think it really is something that's very new. I'd like to move on to another area in which Old Masters collections really distinguish themselves, and that's in conservation science. Now, this field relies very heavily on new investigative and imaging techniques. It's often opaque, very difficult to explain to a broad audience, even often to specialists like me. But this is a field which is often itself based on new technologies, and it lends itself beautifully to sharing that content in all kinds of ways, and it's very exciting. I'm going to start with a couple of simple examples. Infrared technology. We've been able to use that for a long time to look under the surface of a painting without disturbing it. And it picks up carbon, so it picks up underdrawing that's under the surface. We offered gigapixel images to a company called Mad Pixel, a factory. It's a Spanish company, and they developed an app for us And this is just a still image. For example, in this image, which is a work by Rubens and Bruegel in our collection, we've got a super high-res picture plus infrared. And then when you zoom into it on the app, and I urge you all to have a look, you can see, for example, here on the screen, the detail of the two dogs. If you look in the infrared and you look closely, you can see how Bruegel, in this case, the artist who did the dogs, actually changed the dog on the right. Do you see there's a little tail back there, and he actually moved it. This is the kind of work that we do all the time as art historians, but now with these high-res images and a very easy-to-use app, we can share it with a broader public. A much, much more sophisticated version of this type of image processing is being produced by Professor Robert Erdmann, who's at the University of Amsterdam and the Rijksmuseum, and he figured out something called a curtain viewer, which you see here on screen, and he allows you to compare various images of the same picture. So on the left, the actual surface of the picture. Under that, I think, is infrared. The third one's X-ray, and there's UV. And as you can see from the left two slices, that where there's actually a fruit in the final painting, underneath that is a face. And so you can watch the artist change his painting in his work. You literally peel away the layers. This is fabulously high resolution, and you can all have a look at it on the Bosch website. So far, so straightforward. We're comparing images. We're back to that. But what do you do with much more complex information? Let me introduce you, please, to the case of Saul and David. And what you see on the screen is a painting by Rembrandt in our collection. It shows King Saul on the left, wearing the turban, and he is moved by little David, who's playing his harp in the lower right screen. Now, this is a painting that was extremely dirty in 2007, and when I joined the Mauritshuis in 2008, we decided to research it with an eye towards conservation. And we had a number of very basic art historical research questions. Provenance, where did it come from? Dimensions, in this case, how big was it, but how big was it originally? Iconography, what can we see on the screen? How did the artist depict the story? And attribution, of course, was this by Rembrandt or not? The provenance, fairly straightforward. It was bought by one of my predecessors at the gallery, a Rembrandt scholar named Abraham Bredius. With great fanfare, he brought it to the gallery, and you see on the picture on the right, it was one of the most important Rembrandts in the Mauritshuis. This is an old picture. Until in the 1960s, someone came along and said, "No, it's not by Rembrandt. It's by someone else." And he did this on the basis of the painting as it was. It was extremely dirty, lots of overpainting, and the judgment was made on the basis of the scholarship at that point in the 60s. So this was a big question. I'm going to whiz through a couple of ideas and then come back how we presented it. Dimensions were an issue. This is how big it was, but we had an indication, this is just extracts from the provenance, that it was at some point in 1830 quite a lot larger than it is now. What we then did was took a look at the X-rays, and these X-rays had been made in the 70s, but now with new imaging techniques, we can have much higher resolution. And so we had now an X-ray that we could blow up and get a lot more information out of. And to make a very long story short, we were able to find out that the painting now consists of some 14 different pieces of canvas, all stitched together, and this is a map of it. And this is because we had this high res, we could really study it. You can see in the upper right corner, there's an insert. You can see it here very clearly. We were able to determine, you see it left on the screen, that this was actually part of an entirely other painting that had at one point been slotted in there. Because the Rembrandt had been taken apart, had been cut into two pieces at some point and brought back together. And thanks to a colleagues at the Rijksmuseum, we were able to determine that that painting that was slotted in was a copy of a painting by Van Dyck, and that Van Dyck you see on the right. What fabulous information we got. And I have here, the next screen is a little film showing you how that all works together. Very nice use of really great images and animation together. That's the bottom. You can see those little fingers coming by. That's a slot from another picture. This is a very odd dog-tooth seam that is pretty much unique. And this is the painting in its stripped state. If we took it apart, this is the subject of years of study before we figure this out. this is what we found out. Really great stuff. We also use another new technology, which is called weave angle mapping. When you stretch canvas onto a stretcher, it creates cusping. So the strings put tension on the canvas. And this is with high-res images. You can see on the right where it's blue and red, on the left image, all the way on the right, that indicates strong cusping, and in other areas, none at all. So we were able to estimate how much canvas had been cut off of this painting and where, and came to the conclusion that this was probably what it originally looked like in terms of dimensions. The question of iconography was complicated. There is no precedent in the history of art of King Saul wiping his eyes on a curtain like a hanky. And that area of the painting was entirely overpainted. We took all kinds of paint samples, did everything we could, but we really had a big argument. Was that curtain there to cover something that we couldn't see, or was it originally there? And we use another new technology called macro X-ray fluorescence scanning, macro XRF for short, which isolates pigments in the paint. So oil paint is made of a binder oil with pigments in it, and those pigments are made of elements. We're able to isolate the certain elements, and the isolation of cobalt proved to be absolutely wonderful, because what this shows in that red square is cobalt, and it shows us that under all that overpaint there was indeed a curtain. So no matter what the art historians who said this couldn't be right, because you never see a curtain in the history of art, we knew using new technologies that it was under there. And this, of course, informed our treatment. This is before treatment. You start taking off the varnish, and you get this kind of dramatic results. This is in its stripped state, very scary thing. Then we put a layer of varnish on, so everything's reversible. Then we start filling in. And voila, the final results. And I'm delighted to tell you that we decided that, yes, the entire painting is by Rembrandt, painted in 2 phases, although it has been damaged over time because of conservation treatments. Great result. We did this, this is, you cannot read, but it's kind of deliberate. This is the entire team that worked on this. We had scholars, we had scientists, we had people in new technology. This is like medical research these days. Everybody is so specialized that we need to bring together a huge team. In this area, it used to be one man, it was always a man, sitting in his office going, this is a Rembrandt and this isn't, and I know. It doesn't work like that anymore. So how then do you bring this to an audience? How do you bring this to people who know nothing about Rembrandt, let alone macro XRF scanning? This is a still picture of the exhibition that I curated for the Maurits House. I'm going to show you a little film of it in a moment, but what you'll see is we took the 4 main research topics, we put little mini lectures on a video, and they were accompanied by iPads so people could follow along. In a final section there in the rear, you see literally a 3D print of a reproduction. We worked together with TU Delft, Technical University Delft, to 3D print the areas of the painting that have remained, which are quite textured, and we just used 2D in the areas that are lost, and visitors could come in there and even touch the reproduction. So may I have the film, please? We called it the case of Saul and David, of course, because this was like a CSI case. We wanted to find out, what was going on here, and that was the way we were able to reach people with it. We had a couple loans from abroad, and there you see videos going and people following along with iPads. I had 15-year-old kids from Germany who were there for hours. I mean, it was great. There you see we got another copy, like the one that was cut and put into the painting. That's the 3D reproduction in the background. Yeah, someone's fingering it. Here's the issue of attribution. We let different people give their opinions. There was someone on the video who disagreed with our attribution. Fine, get it all out there. We're open to everybody's opinion. But in the end, this was, of course, the main event, which was the painting itself. Now, that was in a couple years ago. We continue to share this type of really complex scientific research with our public. And you may have seen in the New York Times that a few months ago we set up a temporary gallery in the Golden Room of the Moritz House with, of course, our girl with a pearl earring. And we subjected her in a period of 2 very intense weeks to the most cutting-edge new technologies that you can do. And it was the first time that they'd all been brought to bear at one point on a picture. And I really encourage you to look on our website and read the blog by our head researcher, Abby Vanderveer, the one with the blue hair. She looks great, too. And she is able to translate this very complicated material into a kind of a language that invites you to follow along. I'm going back to my idea of narrative, right, of storytelling. Very important, even more so with this kind of research. And by the way, of course, we repeated our trick of the 3D print, which we had developed with Delft and with Osei, that's a subsidiary of Canon. So anyone who didn't see the painting up on the wall could come over and have a look at the best possible reproduction we could make of her. I'd like to turn my attention now to VR and AR. There are lots of new developments in virtual reality and augmented reality, and they are really tempting. And we have dipped our toe in the water. In 2016, we had an exhibition of Dutch genre paintings from the British Royal Collection, which included this fantastic Vermeer on the left of your screen. And we put a classic British telephone box on the forecourt of the Moritz House, and you could put a goggles on and sort of walk around the interior of the painting. I gotta confess, it's not hugely innovative, and I didn't think it was great, but it was a really good marketing tool. But I want to show you this because it makes a kind of a point that I'm going to go further on now. We left the booth outside on the forecourt. It wasn't in the exhibition. And I've got to be honest, I am somewhat reticent about VR in combination with fine art. I think it's very different in other types of museums, say a science museum. It can be very effective. But for us, it can be distracting. There are some good ways to do it. Recently, in the Modigliani exhibition at the Tate, there was a kind of sweaty little, horrible little room on the side, but you could go in there and put a goggle on and actually walk around Modigliani's studio. That was wonderful. But I think what we're kind of worried about is what happens if you have a goggle on and you bash into an actual painting. It's that simple. Last year, a private collection of Dutch paintings, the Kramer Collection, launched a VR app. And this is another kind of situation. They don't actually have a permanent home. They don't have a gallery, but they have lots of paintings. And they spent an inordinate amount of money. I don't know exactly what it was, but it must have been a lot, to digitize the collection in super high res. And they hired an architect to come up with the fictitious space. You can see it here. It's very modernistic. And you can see all the paintings all around on the walls. I'm not entirely convinced for 2 reasons. One, when I use this and when you put the headset on, the hardware can't deal with the images. It's like you look through a chain link fence. So the hardware hasn't really quite caught up. The other thing is, this is not a storytelling site. You can walk around it and you can see a wall label and a very stiff little video of the owner, but it doesn't really get you farther in your thinking. It goes up to there and no farther. And finally, I think for something like this to be a success, they want people to download the app for money. I think you need a real iconic work like a girl with a pearl earring or a goldfinch, really, to sell something like this. But I'm willing to debate with you, so I'm waiting for the question and answer period. Now, in spite of our reticence to allow goggles into the gallery, we have experimented with AR. Last year, the Moritz House used Microsoft's HoloLens to explain the complicated story of Saul and David that I just showed you in the context of the exhibition. We won a Silver Spin Award in the category of VR AR for it, but I do not yet see this as a permanent addition to our interpretive offerings. It's high maintenance. We can only use it when the galleries are really quiet. At peak times, like now, at this moment, we're jammed. It's completely busy. This kind of thing really just gets in the way. So I would like to submit at this particular time. I'm really open to see what's going to happen, but and we want to explore new technologies, but sometimes simple logistics, practical things get in the way and make some of these great ideas fairly unworkable. My strategy at the Maurits House is to follow best practice where it's already been established, think about protocols for digitizing, but also to be truly innovative in a number of specific projects. And I think the Google initiative that I introduced to you just now is one of these, more for diplomacy, And another is the collaboration that we've just started with Ibm Watson. We've actually just rounded off a pilot project to see if we can answer questions about Rembrandt using their artificial intelligence program, Watson. And we had two objectives in mind. One, can Watson answer the kind of run-of-the-mill questions we get all the time in the gallery? People constantly say to me, this is a really stupid question, but there is no such thing as a stupid question, but sometimes an app or a machine is a much more accessible way to ask that. And we think AI may be able to help with that. And secondly, can machine learning let loose over big data result in entirely new research questions that we as art historians would never be able to come up with? And what you see on the slide is we're collecting questions during a museum night about the anatomy lesson by Rembrandt, and we use those questions to train Watson. The app that resulted from this pilot is not yet what we'd like it to be, but IBM is committed to the project, so we're going to continue working in this area, and we'll certainly let you know if anything comes out of it. I need to round off now, but what I wanted to do this afternoon is to give you a taster of how we use new technologies to make old master paintings come alive for various audiences, from scientists to first-time visitors. And I'm really proud to say that the Maurits House is a leader, not only in terms of its fabulous collection, but the way in which we study it and share the results with our visitors. Having said all that, I want to show you a slide. This is what the galleries look like just about now. They're crowded. They're busy. People love it. They're not as bad as maybe in front of the Mona Lisa, but it's popular. It's going well. So in the end, no matter how sophisticated the technologies are that we harness, our primary obligation is to the collection, to the physical object. That's where our focus goes in the end if we have to make a choice. And in that sense, not that much has changed since the period I discussed at the very beginning of my lecture, some 20 years ago. We're still careful when it comes to new technologies and want to use them to enhance and deepen the knowledge we share with our visitors with our visitors without disturbing the actual physical object. So to conclude, before I take some questions, I want to share a little marketing video that we sent out into the world in 2014 after we reopened our museum. We're at the end of a long, big building project. And I'm just going to let it play, and I think it really says it all.
All over the world, you'll find images of The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Johannes Vermeer. The Japanese professor of microbiology, Shinichi Fukuoka, is one of the many people captivated by the painting. He followed the painting during its recent world tour and plans to visit it now that it's returned home to The Hague. Because even though he's got a perfect reproduction in his own home, nothing beats the real thing. That's why, especially for this mega fan, we've turned things around for just one day and built a replica of his apartment at the museum. This way, Shin can enjoy the original painting in a reproduction of his home. Would you like to enjoy the same experience? Visit mauritshouse.nl. Discover the original at the Maurits House.
The result was this was a competition on Facebook, and someone from Haarlem won it the second time around. Thank you.